First, I want to thank the Foreign Policy Association and also the members of the Board of Directors of Evercore and my partners who very generously showed up here tonight. I have prepared a 45-minute speech, but I'm only going to give 40 minutes of it. I started my career, as Jillian said, in Washington, working in government. I spent 3 years working in the Senate and House as a member of the staff of the Joint Economic Committee of Congress, and then 4 years in the White House staff under President Carter. And the Washington that I worked in was a really different Washington from the Washington today. There were a huge number of people in both bodies of Congress and in both parties who always stepped forward to do the right thing for the country. And there was no area where that was more evident than in foreign policy. The first person I worked for was Senator Hubert Humphrey, who was the chairperson, or chairman, I guess at that time, they didn't have chairpersons, of the Joint Economic Committee. And he was about as partisan a Democrat as you can imagine. And I remember one day we had a hearing and Secretary Bill Simon was going to testify. And as would always happen, we would brief the senator the night before, late afternoon. And there happened to be an area that I was expert in, and I suggested to the senator that the next day when Bill Simon testified that he should give an opening statement on that topic and then ask lots of questions. And Senator Humphrey said, great idea, write a statement for me, write a lot of questions. So I was 23 years old, I stayed up most of the night. The next day I was that proverbial kid you see behind a senator shoving things in front of them that they push aside. And he never said a word about that. And, you know, I was 9 months into my career, and, you know, I couldn't understand why somebody would make me stay up all night and not use anything that I had done. So I asked him about it, and it was really simple. He said, Secretary, and by the way, Humphrey and Bill Simon were polar opposites in terms of their beliefs, and they also didn't like each other personally. But he said to me, Secretary Simon called me at 10 o'clock last night and said the discussions about this particular topic are at a particularly sensitive point, and I'd appreciate it if you stay away from it. And the sad thing about, you know, our country today and why we need a Foreign Policy Association is, in all likelihood, that phone call would not be made today. And if it were, the chairman of the committee would call his staff and say, I just got a call from the Secretary of the Treasury. He wants me to stay away from this, so I want you to write an opening statement for me, blasting him on it, and a lot of really good questions. So I just finished reading this book, How Democracies Fail. And it's a book written by two Harvard political historians, one who's a specialist in Europe and one who's a specialist in South America. And it describes how autocrats and fascists who initially are elected hijack democracy. And they write about the traits that all of these people shared, whether it was Mussolini or Perón or whatever. And, you know, things like completely discounting the institutions that are checks and balances, like the courts and the media, demonizing your opponents as criminals. None of this, of course, sounds very familiar, but, you know, I think we have an incredibly long tradition in this country of a very bipartisan foreign policy. And while there are many differences that occur when Republicans succeed Democrats and Democrats succeed Republicans in domestic policy. Historically, that has not been as much the case in foreign policy. And I guess my one hope is that this organization can move us a little closer to that older world. Thank you.